Why you should never look into the mirror at midnight. The mirror shattered into thousands of shards, yet her reflection remained intact. It stared back at her, unmoving, unblinking, its lips curling into a sinister smile. Adunni stumbled back, her hands trembling as she felt a strange pull toward the fractured glass. Her heart pounded as the reflection stepped out of the mirror, a perfect copy of her, but with eyes like bottomless pits. "You should not have looked," the reflection hissed, its voice like a whisper carried on a harsh wind. The room grew colder, and Adunni's breath clouded the air. The reflection took a step forward, its hand reaching out. Suddenly, the oil lamp flickered and died, plunging the room into darkness. Adunni screamed. It started 2 weeks earlier, in the small village of Oren. The people of Oren were deeply rooted in their traditions, guided by the wisdom of elders and the tales passed down from generations. Among these tales was one warning everyone never to look into a mirror at midnight. It wasn't just a superstition, it was a law. Adunni had always been curious. She was 14, stubborn, and known for questioning everything. Her friends often joked about her being the one to anger the spirits, but she shrugged it off, chalking their fears up to ignorance. Her curiosity peaked when her grandmother, Nkechi, a respected storyteller in the village, spoke of the mirrors. "Why can't we look into them at night?" Adunni had asked one evening while they sat around the fire. Nkechi's face darkened. "It is not for you to question the spirits, child. The mirror is a gateway. Midnight is when the veil between our world and theirs is thinnest. Those who look may see something they cannot unsee." Adunni scoffed. "But why would they care if we look? Isn't it just our reflection?" Nkechi didn't answer. She only stared at the flames, her silence more unnerving than any story. That night, as the village slept, Adunni lay awake in her small hut. Her mother's soft snores filled the room, but Adunni's mind raced. What could possibly happen? Was it all just a way to scare children into obedience? She resolved to find out. The next day, she borrowed a mirror from her friend Kemi, who kept it hidden from her strict parents. Mirrors were rare in the village, reserved for special occasions like weddings or ceremonies. Adunni's plan was simple. She would wait until midnight and look into the mirror to prove that nothing would happen. She didn't tell anyone, not even Kemi. This was her secret experiment. The night of her plan, a strange heaviness settled over the village. The air felt charged, and the usual sounds of crickets and distant drums were absent. Adunni felt a shiver of doubt, but quickly brushed it aside. She lit an oil lamp and placed the mirror on the ground in front of her. As the clock struck midnight, she leaned forward, her face reflected in the dim light. Her heart raced as she stared at her own eyes, waiting for something, anything, to happen. For a moment, it seemed as though her grandmother's warnings were unfounded. Her reflection stared back, just as it always had. But then, the reflection blinked. Adunni froze. She hadn't blinked. Her reflection tilted its head slightly, as if studying her, and a slow, eerie smile spread across its face. The oil lamp flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. Adunni's breath hitched as the reflection moved, its hand rising to press against the inside of the mirror's surface. The reflection mouthed words she couldn't hear, but she didn't need to. The message was clear. "Let me out." Adunni scrambled back, her hand knocking over the lamp. The glass cracked, and darkness swallowed the room. She fumbled for the door, her fingers trembling as she pulled it open and stumbled into the night. The cool air hit her face, but her terror didn't subside. In her haste, she had left the mirror behind, its cracked surface gleaming faintly in the moonlight. The next day, Adunni avoided her grandmother. She couldn't bring herself to speak of what she had seen. Her friends noticed her unease, but she brushed off their concerns, claiming she was tired. She told herself it was just her imagination. Perhaps she had been too tired, and her mind had played tricks on her. But the dreams began that night. In her dreams, she was back in the room, staring at the mirror. The reflection called her name in a voice that sounded like hers, but wasn't. It begged, taunted, and threatened. Adunni woke up drenched in sweat. The image of her grinning reflection burned into her mind. Days passed and the dreams grew worse. Her friends noticed the dark circles under her eyes, but Adunni avoided their questions. She became withdrawn, her once bright spirit dimmed by the weight of her secret. One evening, Kemi confronted her. Adunni, you've been acting strange. Did something happen? You can tell me. Adunni hesitated. Kemi was her closest friend, but the fear of being judged, or worse, being believed, kept her silent. She forced a smile. I'm fine, Kemi. Just tired. But Kemi wasn't convinced. She followed Adunni home that night, determined to find out the truth. As Adunni slipped into her hut, Kemi waited outside, watching the flicker of light from the oil lamp. What she saw next made her blood run cold. Through the small window, she saw Adunni sitting in front of the cracked mirror, whispering to it. The lamp's light cast strange, shifting shadows, and for a brief moment, Kemi thought she saw another face in the glass.
Kemi ran.
Adunni's nights continued to spiral into chaos. The reflection was no longer confined to the mirror or her dreams. She began to see it in pools of water, in the gleam of polished pots, and even in the eyes of those around her. It was always watching, always waiting. And then, the reflection came out. It happened on a moonless night, when the village was silent and the air was heavy with an unnatural stillness. Adunni had been sitting alone in her hut, staring at the broken mirror, when the reflection stepped through. Adunni didn't remember screaming, but the villagers came running, their torches illuminating her empty hut. The mirror was gone, replaced by a dark, gaping void in the center of the room. The reflection had taken her place. The villagers searched the hut, their torches flickering as they peered into every shadowed corner. Adunni's mother, Yowanda, clutched her chest, her eyes darting wildly as she called her daughter's name. But the only sound in the room was the faint crackle of burning oil lamps. She's not here, someone whispered, fear lacing their voice. Yowanda refused to believe it. She tore through the small space, throwing aside mats and pots as though her daughter might be hiding. Adunni, she screamed, her voice breaking. Where are you? Elder Nkechi arrived, her presence silencing the murmurs. Her weathered face was grim as she surveyed the scene. She moved toward the center of the room where the strange void shimmered faintly, like a heat mirage on a hot day. Kneeling beside it, she whispered words in a language no one recognized. The void rippled, but it didn't disappear. What is that? A man asked, his voice shaking. Nkechi rose slowly. This is not of our world. She turned to the villagers, her voice steady despite the unease in her eyes. Adunni has broken the law of the spirits. Gasps filled the room. Yowanda collapsed to her knees, her face streaked with tears. What do you mean? She is a child. She would never. She looked into a mirror at midnight. Nkechi interrupted, her tone heavy with certainty. And now, the spirits have taken her. The villagers recoiled. Everyone knew the tale, but no one had ever dared to test it. To hear it spoken aloud felt like calling down a curse. But where is she? Kemi asked, her voice small. She had been standing in the doorway, her face pale. What did they do to her? Nkechi's eyes flickered toward the void. She is beyond our reach. Meanwhile, Adunni found herself in a place that defied explanation. The air was cold and damp, and an unnatural fog clung to her skin like a second layer. Around her stretched a barren wasteland, illuminated by a pale, sourceless light. The ground beneath her feet was smooth, as though carved from obsidian. She turned in circles, her heart pounding as she tried to make sense of her surroundings. Where am I? She whispered, her voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. Home, a voice replied, soft and chillingly familiar. Adunni spun around to see her reflection standing a few feet away. It wasn't just a reflection anymore. It was solid, real, and utterly wrong. Its eyes were black voids, and its smile stretched wider than humanly possible. You brought me here, it said, taking a step closer. Now we are free. Adunni backed away, her legs trembling. I didn't bring you anywhere. What do you want? The reflection tilted its head, a mockery of her own curious gesture. I want what you have. Your life, your place in your world. And now it grinned wider, if that was even possible. I have it. Aduni's breath came in short gasps as she tried to understand what it meant. You're in the village? Yes, it said simply. And you are here. Fair trade, don't you think? No. Aduni shouted, her voice echoing in the emptiness. You can't do this. Let me go back. The reflection laughed, a hollow, distorted sound. It doesn't work like that. You cross the line. You open the door. Now you belong here. Aduni clenched her fists, a mix of anger and fear coursing through her. I'll find a way out. I'll stop you. The reflection's grin faltered for the first time. It stepped closer, its voice dropping to a menacing whisper. You cannot stop what has already begun. Before Aduni could respond, the ground beneath her feet shifted. She stumbled, falling to her knees as the obsidian surface cracked and pulsed with an eerie red light. The reflection stepped back, a smug look on its face as the ground opened up, swallowing Aduni whole. Back in the village, the void in the center of the hut began to change. It pulsed, emitting a low, rhythmic hum that made the villagers cover their ears. Yowanda clung to Nkechi's arm, her eyes wide with terror. What is happening? The spirits are restless, Nkechi murmured. She turned to the gathered crowd. We must leave this place.
Now.
But before anyone could move, the void burst into a brilliant light, blinding everyone in the room. When the light faded, Aduni stood in the center, her face calm, her eyes downcast. Aduni! Yowanda cried, rushing toward her. Nkechi grabbed her arm, stopping her. Wait! Aduni looked up slowly, and the villagers froze. Her eyes were black as night, and her lips curled into a smile that wasn't hers. Thank you, she said, her voice layered with a strange echo. You've set me free. Yowanda stumbled back, her face pale. What is this? Aduni, what are you saying? The girl tilted her head, a gesture so eerily familiar that Kemi felt her stomach drop. Aduni is gone, the girl said. She belongs to the spirits now. The villagers erupted into chaos, shouting and scrambling to leave the hut. Nkechi stood her ground, her sharp eyes fixed on the girl. You are not her, she said calmly. What do you want? The girl grinned, her teeth unnaturally sharp. I want what was promised. A life for a life. The hut trembled, and the walls began to crack. Nkechi grabbed Yowanda and pulled her toward the door. Run, she shouted. The villagers scattered into the night, the sound of the girl's laughter echoing behind them. But as they fled, Kemi hesitated, her heart pounding. She turned back to see the figure standing alone in the ruined hut, its eyes gleaming with malice. Kemi knew the truth. That wasn't Aduni. But if Aduni was truly gone, where was she? The next morning, the villagers gathered in the square, their faces etched with fear. The elders debated what to do, but no one had answers. Nkechi stood apart from the group, staring into the distance. Kemi approached her, her voice trembling. Elder, we have to help Aduni. We can't leave her like this. Nkechi's face was grave. She is beyond our reach. But there must be something we can do. Kemi insisted. You said the spirits took her. Can't we bargain with them? Bring her back. Nkechi sighed heavily. The spirits do not bargain. But there may be another way. Kemi's eyes lit up with hope. What is it? Nkechi hesitated. It is dangerous. If we fail, we risk more than just our lives. We risk our very souls. Kemi squared her shoulders, her fear replaced by determination. I'll do whatever it takes. Nkechi placed a hand on her shoulder, her gaze steady. Then prepare yourself. Tonight we go into the void. As the sun set over the village, the air grew heavy with anticipation. The people of Orin huddled in their homes, whispering prayers and lighting protective charms. But in the elder's hut, Kemi and Nkechi prepared for a journey no one had ever returned from. The void was waiting, the night was unnaturally quiet, as though the village itself was holding its breath. Inside Elder Nkechi's hut, the flickering light of a single oil lamp illuminated the faces of Nkechi and Kemi. The air smelled of burning herbs, their smoke curling toward the roof like spectral fingers. Nkechi had drawn intricate symbols on the floor, each line etched with ash from sacred wood. "These marks will shield us from harm," Nkechi explained, her voice low. "But once we enter the void, they cannot protect us. You must stay close to me at all times." Kemi nodded, her hands trembling as she clutched a small satchel filled with items Nkechi had instructed her to bring: a knife, a small gourd of blessed water, and a piece of Aduni's clothing. Each item, Nkechi had said, would be crucial if they were to find Aduni. "Are you certain about this?" Nkechi asked, her piercing eyes meeting Kemi's. "There is no shame in turning back." Kemi's heart raced, but she forced herself to stand tall. "Aduni is my friend. I can't leave her to whatever this is." Nkechi nodded solemnly. "Then let us begin." She began chanting in a language Kemi didn't understand, her voice steady and rhythmic. The symbols on the floor began to glow faintly, their light pulsing in time with Nkechi's words. The air grew colder, and a low hum filled the room, vibrating deep in Kemi's chest. The void appeared. It wasn't like before. This time, it didn't shimmer or ripple. It was a gaping hole of absolute darkness, its edges jagged like a wound torn in the fabric of reality. Kemi swallowed hard, her legs trembling as Nkechi stepped forward, her hand gripping Kemi's arm tightly. "Do not let go," Nkechi warned. "No matter what you see, no matter what you hear, you must stay with me." Kemi nodded, her voice caught in her throat. Together, they stepped into the void. The air changed instantly. It was heavy and thick, making it hard to breathe. The ground beneath Kemi's feet was cold and smooth, and the darkness around them seemed alive, shifting and swirling like smoke. There was no sound except for the faint echo of their footsteps. Kemi gripped Nkechi's hand tightly, her fear growing with every step. "Where are we?" she whispered. "The in-between," Nkechi replied. "It is neither our world nor theirs. It is a place of lost souls." Kemi shivered, her eyes darting around the oppressive darkness. She thought she saw shapes moving at the edge of her vision, but when she turned her head, there was nothing there. "How will we find Aduni here?" "She will find us," Nkechi said, her voice steady. "But be warned, so will the others." Kemi's stomach churned. "The others?" Nkechi didn't answer. Instead, she pulled a small vial of oil from her satchel and began marking the symbols of protection on their foreheads. "This will keep the worst of them at bay. But it will not work against her." Kemi froze. "Her? Who's hers?" Before Nkechi could respond, a low, guttural laugh echoed through the darkness. Kemi's heart leapt into her throat as the laugh grew louder, reverberating around them. The darkness shifted, and a figure emerged, a tall, gaunt woman with hollow eyes and a twisted grin. "You dare to enter my realm?" the woman hissed, her voice like nails scraping against metal. "Foolish mortals." Kemi clung to Nkechi, her breath coming in short gasps. Nkechi stepped forward, her voice firm. "We seek the child. She does not belong here." The woman laughed again, her skeletal frame shaking with the effort. "The child is ours now. You cannot take what has been claimed. She is not yours to claim," Nkechi said, her voice rising. She pulled the gourd of blessed water from her satchel and splashed it toward the woman. The water hissed and sizzled as it hit the air, forming a barrier between them and the creature. The woman shrieked, her hollow eyes narrowing. "You will regret this." She disappeared into the darkness, her laughter echoing behind her. Kemi's legs felt like jelly as she turned to Nkechi. "What was that?" "A gatekeeper," Nkechi said grimly. "She will not let us leave easily." They continued deeper into the void, the oppressive darkness pressing against them like a living thing. The ground beneath their feet began to change, growing rough and uneven. Strange whispers filled the air, voices that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Kemi clutched Aduni's piece of clothing, holding it close to her chest. "Aduni," she called out, her voice trembling. "If you can hear me, we're here. Please answer me." For a moment, there was only silence. Then, faintly, a voice responded. Kemi? Kemi's heart leapt. A dunny! Where are you? This way, the voice said, weak and distant. Hurry! Kemi started to run toward the sound, but Nkechi pulled her back.
Wait.
It could be a trick. It's her. I know it is. Kemi insisted, tears streaming down her face. She broke free from Nkechi's grip and ran into the darkness, following the voice. Kemi, stop! Nkechi shouted, but it was too late. The darkness seemed to close in around Kemi as she ran, the voice growing louder. Kemi, help me, it cried. Please, I'm here. Kemi stumbled to a stop, her breath ragged. She saw a figure lying on the ground, curled up and trembling. A dunny, she cried, rushing forward. But as she reached out to touch the figure, it turned toward her, and she froze. It wasn't a dunny. The creature's face was twisted and grotesque, its eyes glowing with malevolence. It lunged at her, its mouth opening impossibly wide. Kemi screamed as it grabbed her arm, its grip like ice. Suddenly, Nkechi appeared, her knife slashing through the creature's arm. It howled and recoiled, retreating into the darkness. Nkechi grabbed Kemi, pulling her to her feet. I told you to stay close. Nkechi snapped, her face pale. You cannot trust anything here. Kemi nodded, her tears mixing with sweat.
I'm sorry.
I thought it was her. We must be careful, Nkechi said, her voice softer now. The spirits here will use your fear against you. They continued walking, the silence between them heavy. Kemi kept her eyes fixed on Nkechi, afraid to look anywhere else. The oppressive darkness seemed endless, and she felt as though they had been walking for hours. Just when Kemi thought she couldn't take another step, they came to a clearing. In the center was a pool of water, its surface still and black. Floating above the pool was a dunny, her body limp and pale. A dunny! Kemi cried, rushing forward. But as she stepped closer, the ground beneath her feet began to crack. She froze, her breath hitching as the cracks spread outward, glowing with a fiery red light. Do not move! Nkechi shouted, her voice sharp with urgency. Before Kemi could respond, the pool erupted and a massive figure emerged, a shadowy beast with glowing eyes and claws like jagged blades. It roared, the sound shaking the very ground beneath them. Kemi and Nkechi stood frozen as the beast loomed over them, its eyes locking onto Kemi. The air grew thick with its presence, and Kemi's knees buckled under the weight of its gaze. The beast roared again, and the ground split open, swallowing the pool and a dunny with it. The void trembled, and Kemi felt herself being pulled toward the chasm. Nkechi grabbed her arm, holding on with all her strength. Kemi, hold on, Nkechi shouted. But the beast lunged, its claws tearing through the air, and the void erupted into chaos. The beast's claws sliced through the space where Kemi and Nkechi stood just moments before. Nkechi had yanked Kemi backward with a force that sent them tumbling to the ground. The void seemed alive now, writhing and heaving as if protesting their presence. The chasm where a dunny had disappeared pulsed with an eerie, blood-red light, the beast circling it like a predator guarding its prize. Kemi's ears rang from the beast's roar, her body trembling as she tried to stand. A dunny, she screamed, her voice barely audible over the chaos. Quiet, Nkechi hissed, pulling her close. She pressed a hand to Kemi's forehead, murmuring words of protection. The glowing symbols etched on their skin flared brighter for a moment, and the oppressive weight of the void lessened slightly. The beast turned its glowing eyes toward them, its movements slow and deliberate. Its form seemed to shift with every step, one moment humanoid, the next an unrecognizable mass of shadow and flame. It bared its jagged teeth, a low growl reverberating through the air. It knows we are here for her, Nkechi muttered, her voice steady, but laced with urgency. It will not let us leave easily. What do we do? Kemi whispered, her voice shaking. We can't just leave her. We won't, Nkechi said firmly. She reached into her satchel, pulling out the small gourd of blessed water and the knife. But we must act carefully. One wrong move, and we will both be lost. The beast lunged suddenly, closing the distance between them in an instant. Nkechi threw the blessed water into its path, and it shrieked as the liquid sizzled on its shadowy form. The air filled with the acrid smell of burning, and the beast stumbled back, its roar shaking the ground. "This way," Nkechi shouted, grabbing Kemi's hand and pulling her toward the chasm. The ground beneath their feet cracked and crumbled, but they kept moving, the red light of the chasm growing brighter with as they neared the edge. Kemi's eyes widened. She could see Adunni, her body suspended in the air above the swirling red void. Her face was pale, her eyes closed, and her limbs hung limp. Kemi's heart clenched. "She's there. We're so close." "Do not rush," Nkechi warned, her eyes never leaving the chasm. She knelt at its edge, drawing symbols in the air with her knife. The blade glowed faintly as she chanted, the light forming a protective barrier around them. The beast roared again, its form shifting wildly as it charged toward them. Nkechi stood, raising the knife. "Hold it off," she commanded, thrusting the knife into Kemi's hands. "What? Me?" Kemi stammered, panic rising in her chest. "You are strong enough," Nkechi said, her voice calm but firm. "The blade is blessed. Use it wisely." Before Kemi could protest, Nkechi turned her attention back to the chasm, her chants growing louder. The ground beneath her feet cracked and split, but she remained steady, her focus unbroken. The beast lunged again, its massive form blotting out the faint light of the void. Kemi's grip on the knife tightened as she stepped forward, her knees trembling. She raised the blade, its glowing edge cutting through the darkness. "Stay back," she shouted, her voice trembling but determined. The beast hesitated, its glowing eyes narrowing as it regarded the blade. It growled low, circling her like a predator stalking its prey. Kemi's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to back down. Behind her, Nkechi's chanting reached a crescendo. The symbols she had drawn in the air flared brightly, their light forming a bridge over the chasm. Adunni's body began to lower slowly, the red light around her dimming. The beast roared in fury, its attention snapping to Nkechi. It lunged toward her, but Kemi stepped into its path, slashing the blade through its shadowy form. The beast howled in pain, its shape flickering and distorting. Kemi felt a surge of strength as the blade connected, the light from the knife pushing back the darkness. "You won't take hers," Kemi shouted, her fear replaced by a fierce determination. She swung the knife again, the blessed blade slicing through the beast's form. It staggered, its growl turning into a high-pitched wail. "Kemi, now!" Nkechi's voice rang out behind her. Kemi turned to see Nkechi holding Adunni's limp body in her arms, the bridge of light flickering beneath them. "We must go." The beast roared one final time, its massive form surging toward them. Kemi didn't think. She grabbed Nkechi's free arm and helped her step onto the bridge. Together, they ran, the ground beneath them trembling with every step. The bridge began to collapse as they reached the edge of the void. Nkechi leapt forward, pulling Kemi and Adunni with her. They landed hard on the cold, cracked ground, the sound of the void sealing itself behind them. For a moment, there was silence. The oppressive weight of the void lifted, replaced by a chilling stillness. Kemi sat up, her breath ragged as she looked around. Are we out?" Nkechi nodded, her face pale and drawn. "For now." Kemi's gaze shifted to Adunni, who lay motionless on the ground. "Is she?" "She lives," Nkechi said softly, her hand resting on Adunni's forehead. "But she is not safe." "What do you mean?" Kemi asked, her voice rising with panic. Nkechi looked at her, her expression grim. "The spirits do not give without taking. She is with us, but the price has not yet been paid." Before Kemi could respond, Adunni's eyes opened. They were black as night, her lips curling into a smile that wasn't hers. "You should have left me," she whispered, her voice layered with an otherworldly echo. The ground beneath them trembled once more, and Kemi realized their nightmare was far from over. Adunni's blackened eyes seemed to pierce through Kemi as she stared in horror. Her voice, layered with something unearthly, sent chills down Kemi's spine. You should have left me, Adunni repeated, her tone soft yet laced with a chilling finality. Adunni, it's us, Kemi said, trying to keep her voice steady. We came to bring you back. Adunni's twisted smile deepened, and she sat up slowly, her movements unnaturally fluid. You didn't bring me back, she said. You brought her back. Kemi stumbled backward, her heart racing. What does she mean? She asked, her voice breaking as she turned to Nkechi. Nkechi didn't answer immediately. She was watching Adunni closely, her fingers tracing a protective symbol in the dirt. This is not Adunni, she said finally. Her voice was steady, but the tension in her posture betrayed her fear. Something has come back in her place. Adunni, or whatever was now inside her, laughed, a hollow, echoing sound that seemed to come from all around them. You cannot undo what has been done, she said. She opened the door, and now I am free. No, Kemi shouted, stepping forward. You can't have her. We'll find a way to bring her back. The thing wearing Adunni's face tilted its head, a mockery of curiosity. Bring her back, it echoed. You truly don't understand. She is gone. There is no Adunni anymore. Kemi clenched her fists, tears streaming down her face. You're lying. Adunni is strong. She's still in there, and we'll save her. The creature's smile faltered for the first time, and its blackened eyes narrowed. You think you can defy me? It hissed, its voice growing sharp. The ground beneath them began to tremble again, cracks spreading outward from where Adunni sat. Kemi, get back. Nkechi shouted, pulling her behind the protective symbol she had drawn. This is no ordinary spirit. It is an Oro Ajogan, a spirit of vengeance. What does that mean? Kemi asked, her voice trembling. What does it want? It wants retribution, Nkechi said grimly. For crossing into its domain. Adunni, or the thing that had taken her, rose to her feet, her body unnaturally still as the ground quaked around her. Retribution, it said, echoing Nkechi's words.
Yes.
A life for a life. Before either of them could react, the spirit lunged, its movements swift and predatory. Nkechi raised her hands, chanting rapidly as the protective symbols on the ground flared to life. The spirit hit the invisible barrier, hissing in frustration as it was thrown back. Kemi's heart pounded as she watched the spirit writhe against the barrier. What do? We can't just leave her like this. Nkechi's eyes never left the spirit. We can't banish it here. Not without destroying Adunni's body. Then what's the plan? Kemi demanded. We must trap it, Nkechi said. Force it back into the void before it can take full control. The spirit snarled, its voice twisting into something deeper, darker. You think you can trap me? Foolish mortals. This body is mine now, and soon I will take yours as well. The symbols on the ground began to dim as the spirit pressed harder against the barrier. Nkechi's chanting grew louder, her voice rising in desperation. Kemi knelt beside her, gripping the blessed knife tightly. Tell me what to do, she said. Nkechi glanced at her, sweat beading on her forehead. You must weaken it. The knife, strike at its shadow, not the body. Kemi hesitated, her eyes darting to the shadow that stretched unnaturally behind the spirit. It writhed and flickered like smoke, its edges jagged and sharp. Taking a deep breath, she nodded and stepped toward the barrier. As she approached, the spirit's black eyes locked onto her. Brave little girl, it sneered. You think you can harm me? Kemi didn't answer. She raised the knife and plunged it into the shadow. The spirit screamed, its form flickering violently as the knife glowed with a blinding light. The ground shook harder, and cracks spread like spiderwebs beneath them. Kemi now, Nkechi shouted. Strike again before it recovers. Kemi pulled the knife free and stabbed again, her hands trembling. The spirit's screams grew louder, its body convulsing as the shadow twisted and shrank. For a moment, Kemi thought they were winning. But then, the spirit's laughter returned, low and menacing. You think this will stop me? It growled. I am older than your ancestors, stronger than your gods. You cannot destroy me. The ground gave way beneath Kemi's feet, and she stumbled, nearly losing her grip on the knife. The spirit surged forward, breaking through the weakened barrier. Nkechi grabbed Kemi and pulled her back, raising her arms in a desperate attempt to contain it. "Kemi, run!" Nkechi shouted. "I'm not leaving you!" Kemi yelled, her voice cracking. She raised the knife again, her eyes blazing with determination. "We can still stop it." The spirit lunged, its blackened form enveloping them both in shadow. Kemi slashed at it wildly, the blade cutting through the darkness, but doing little to slow it down. Nkechi's voice rose in a final, desperate chant, her hands glowing with a soft, golden light. The light expanded outward, forcing the spirit back. For a brief moment, the darkness receded, and Kemi saw Dunny's face, pale, frightened, and tear-streaked, staring back at her. "Kemi," Adunni whispered, her voice barely audible. "Help me. I'm here," Kemi cried, reaching for her. "Hold on, Adunni. We'll save you." But the light faded, and the spirit's laughter returned, louder and more triumphant than ever. The ground beneath them shattered completely, and all three of them were swallowed by the void. When Kemi opened her eyes, she was lying on a cold, smooth surface. The air was heavy and silent, the oppressive weight of the void pressing down on her. She sat up slowly, her body aching, and looked around. Adunni and Nkechi were nowhere to be seen. "Adunni," she called, her voice echoing eerily. "Nkechi?" There was no answer, only the endless, suffocating darkness. Kemi clutched the knife tightly, her heart pounding. She was alone, trapped in the void with no way out, and no idea if she would ever see her friends again. The silence of the void was deafening. Kemi struggled to steady her breathing, gripping the knife tightly in her trembling hands. The cold, smooth surface beneath her feet seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, the darkness thick and suffocating. "Adunni," she called again, her voice cracking. "Elder Nkechi?" The void swallowed her words, offering no response. Her heart pounded in her chest, the oppressive emptiness pressing down on her. She fought the rising panic, forcing herself to focus. She had to find them. She couldn't stay here alone. Kemi picked a direction and started walking, her footsteps echoing faintly. The knife felt heavy in her hand, but she didn't dare loosen her grip. The void was alive. She could feel it, watching her, waiting for her to make a mistake. As she walked, faint whispers began to creep into the edges of her consciousness. They were soft at first, like the rustle of leaves, but they grew louder with every step. The voices overlapped, indistinct but insistent, tugging at her mind. "Go back," they murmured. "You don't belong here." Kemi shook her head, clamping her hands over her ears. "I won't leave without them," she shouted, her voice trembling. "I don't care what you are. I'm not giving up." The whispers faltered, then grew quiet, as though retreating into the shadows. For a moment, Kemi felt a flicker of relief, but it was short-lived. The ground beneath her feet began to shift, rippling like water. She stumbled, barely managing to keep her balance as the surface warped and twisted. A shape emerged from the darkness ahead, humanoid but wrong. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and unnatural. Kemi froze, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure tilted its head, its glowing eyes locking onto hers. "You came for the girl," it said, its voice echoing eerily. "But she is no longer yours to save." "Where is she?" Kemi demanded, raising the knife. Her voice wavered, but she forced herself to stand her ground. "What have you done to her?" The figure chuckled, a hollow, bone-chilling sound.
"She chose this," it said.
"She opened the door. She invited us in." Kemi shook her head fiercely. She didn't know what she was doing. "It's not her fault." The figure stepped closer, its movements fluid and unnerving. "Fault is irrelevant. The debt must be paid. A life for a life." Kemi's grip on the knife tightened. "Then take me instead," she blurted, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. The figure paused, its glowing eyes narrowing. "You would give yourself in her place?" Kemi hesitated, fear clashing with determination. Yes, she said finally. If it means a dunny can go free, then yes. The figure tilted its head again, considering her. Interesting, it murmured. But it is not so simple. The void does not release its claims so easily. Then what do I have to do? Kemi asked, her voice breaking. Just tell me. The figure smiled, a grotesque mimicry of humanity. If you wish to bargain for the girl's soul, you must face the trials. Succeed, and she may go free. Fail, its smile widened, and you will remain here forever. Kemi swallowed hard, her throat dry. What are the trials? The figure stepped aside, revealing a narrow path that seemed to materialize out of the darkness. It stretched forward endlessly, its surface shimmering faintly with a strange, iridescent light. Walk the path, the figure said. Face what lies ahead. If you survive, you will find her at the end. Kemi took a shaky breath, her mind racing. She didn't trust the figure, but what choice did she have? If there was even a chance to save a dunny, she had to take it. I'll do it, she said, her voice trembling but resolute. The figure stepped back, melting into the shadows. Good luck, little mortal, it said, its voice fading. You'll need it. Kemi stepped onto the path, the surface cool and unnervingly smooth beneath her feet. The shimmering light seemed to pulse faintly, guiding her forward. She gripped the knife tightly, her heart pounding as she walked. The path twisted and turned, the darkness pressing in on all sides. Kemi kept her eyes forward, forcing herself to focus. She didn't know what to expect, but she was ready to face whatever came her way. The first trial came suddenly. Without warning, the darkness around her shifted, forming into a dense forest of shadowy trees. Their twisted branches reached toward her, their sharp edges glinting faintly in the dim light. A low growl echoed through the air, and Kemi froze. From the shadows, a massive creature emerged. It was vaguely wolf-like, but its eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and its teeth were razor-sharp. It circled her slowly, its growl deep and menacing. Kemi's grip on the knife tightened. She took a step back, her mind racing. The creature lunged suddenly, its claws slicing through the air. Kemi barely managed to dodge, the blade of the knife catching the edge of its paw. The creature howled in pain, but it didn't retreat. It turned on her, its movements faster, more aggressive. Kemi swung the knife wildly, her heart pounding as she fought to keep the beast at bay. Think, Kemi, she muttered to herself, her breath ragged. You can't win like this. She remembered Nkechi's words, strike at the shadow, not the body. Her eyes darted to the ground, searching for the creature's shadow. It writhed and shifted beneath it, an extension of its monstrous form. Summoning all her courage, Kemi lunged, plunging the knife into the shadow. The beast screamed, its form flickering and distorting. Kemi pulled the knife free and struck again, the blade glowing brightly as it connected. The shadow writhed violently before finally dissipating, and the beast collapsed, its body melting into the ground. The forest of shadows faded, leaving Kemi alone on the shimmering path. She fell to her knees, her chest heaving as she tried to catch her breath. That was just the first trial, she whispered to herself. I have to keep going. She forced herself to stand, the knife still clutched tightly in her hand. The path stretched endlessly ahead, its faint light beckoning her forward. Somewhere at the end of this journey, a dunny was waiting, and Kemi was determined to bring her back. No matter what it took, the path stretched endlessly, its faint, shimmering light flickering with each step Kemi took. Her heart still pounded from the battle with the shadow beast, but she refused to stop. Her legs ached, and her hands trembled, but the thought of a dunny kept her moving forward. Every so often, the whispers returned, soft, insidious, tugging at the edges of her mind. You can't save her, they murmured. Turn back. It's hopeless. Kemi clenched her jaw and pressed on. I'll save her, she muttered under her breath. I have to. The path began to change again. The smooth surface beneath her feet turned rough and uneven, jagged stones jabbing into her bare soles. The air grew colder, and the oppressive silence gave way to faint, distant cries. Kemi's stomach churned as she realized the cries sounded familiar. They were Adunni's. She broke into a run, ignoring the sharp pain in her feet. The cries grew louder, echoing through the dark void. "Adunni!" Kemi shouted, her voice cracking. "I'm coming. Hold on." The path ended abruptly, opening into a vast expanse filled with floating shards of glass. Each shard shimmered faintly, suspended in midair, and reflected distorted images of the world she had left behind. Some showed the village, others the faces of the people she loved, but all were warped, unnatural, and unsettling. At the center of the expanse, Adunni stood motionless. Her blackened eyes were fixed on one of the shards, her face blank and emotionless. Her lips moved silently, as if she were speaking to the shard, but Kemi couldn't hear her words. "Adunni!" Kemi called, her voice trembling with relief. She stepped onto the expanse, the ground solid yet unnervingly smooth beneath her feet. Adunni didn't react. She remained frozen, her gaze locked on the shard. As Kemi moved closer, she realized the shard reflected not just Adunni, but the creature within her, the shadowy, twisted form that had taken over her friend's body. Kemi's blood ran cold. "Adunni, it's me. Wake up." Still, Adunni didn't respond. Kemi reached out to touch her, but the moment her fingers brushed Adunni's arm, the floating shards exploded into movement. They swirled around her like a cyclone, their edges gleaming sharply as they closed in. Kemi stumbled back, raising the knife defensively. The shards moved with a will of their own, darting toward her like birds of prey. She slashed at them desperately, the blade glinting as it deflected one shard after another. Each time the knife connected, the shards shattered, but more replaced them. Their reflective surfaces flashed images that weren't her own, distorted, monstrous versions of herself, grinning wickedly. "Stop it!" Kemi screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Leave us alone." The shards slowed, their movements becoming more deliberate. They floated in front of her, their surfaces reflecting a single image now. Kemi standing over Adunni, the knife raised, her face twisted in rage. "No," Kemi whispered, shaking her head. "That's not real." The shards pulsed with a faint light, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. She opened the door. "This is her fault. You can end this. Strike her down. She is already lost. Save yourself." Kemi clutched her head, trying to block out the voices.
"No."
"I won't hurt her. She's my friend." The shards trembled, their light flickering as though in frustration. The whispers grew louder, overlapping until they were a deafening roar. Suddenly, the shards shattered all at once, their pieces raining down around her like glass snowflakes. The air grew still, and the oppressive silence returned. Adunni turned slowly, her blackened eyes locking onto Kemi's. "Why are you still here?" she asked, her voice hollow and emotionless. "Adunni, it's me," Kemi said, her voice trembling. "I'm here to bring you home." Adunni's lips twisted into a cruel smile. "There's nothing to save, Kemi.
I belong to the void now.
And soon you will too." "No," Kemi said, stepping forward. She gripped the knife tightly, her hands shaking. "You're wrong. You're still in there, Adunni. I saw you before. I heard you call for me." Adunni tilted her head, a mocking gesture.
"You're a fool," she said.
"You can't fight this. You can't save me." "I can, and I will," Kemi shouted. She raised the knife, pointing it toward Adunni's shadow. "I don't care what it takes. I won't leave you here." The expanse began to tremble, the ground cracking beneath their feet. Adunni's expression faltered for a moment, and for a split second, Kemi thought she saw fear in her friend's blackened eyes. "Kemi," Adunni whispered, her voice breaking.
"Run."
"It's too late." "No,"
Kemi cried.
"I'm not leaving you." The cracks spread, glowing with an ominous red light. From the shattered ground, shadowy tendrils emerged, writhing and twisting as they reached for Kemi. She slashed at them with the knife, but there were too many. One wrapped around her ankle, pulling her to the ground. Adunni watched, her face a mix of anguish and malice. "You can't win," she said softly. "You should have left me." As the tendrils tightened around her, dragging her closer to the chasm, Kemi's grip on the knife faltered. She looked up at Adunni, her eyes filled with tears. "Adunni, please," she whispered. "Fight it. I know you can." For a brief moment, something flickered in Adunni's eyes, a spark of recognition, of humanity. She stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached toward Kemi. But before she could touch her, the tendrils pulled Kemi into the chasm, and the void swallowed her whole. Kemi tumbled through darkness, her screams swallowed by the void. The shadowy tendrils clung to her, cold and unyielding as they dragged her deeper into the chasm. The air was thick and suffocating, and the faint red glow from the cracks above grew dimmer until it disappeared entirely. Just when she thought she couldn't hold her breath any longer, the tendrils released her. She fell onto a cold, jagged surface, the impact knocking the wind from her lungs. Coughing and gasping for air, she pushed herself up, her hands trembling as she tried to take in her surroundings. The place was unlike anything she had seen before. The ground beneath her was blackened and cracked, glowing faintly with streaks of crimson light. Massive spires of jagged rock jutted out at unnatural angles, their edges sharp and glinting. The air buzzed with an unnatural energy, and faint whispers echoed in the distance, too quiet to understand but loud enough to unsettle. Kemi's knife lay a few feet away, its blade glinting faintly in the dim light. She scrambled toward it, her fingers closing around the hilt as she stood, her heart racing. Her voice was hoarse when she called out, "Adunni? Eldern Ketchi? Are you here?" The whispers grew louder, overlapping one another, their words indistinct but mocking. Kemi turned in circles, clutching the knife tightly as the darkness seemed to close in. Shapes moved at the edges of her vision, flickering and fading before she could focus on them. "Show yourselves," she shouted, her voice trembling. "I'm not afraid of you." The whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the space into an unnerving silence. Then, a voice emerged, low, cold, and familiar. "You should be." Kemi turned sharply to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was Adunni, but not. Her blackened eyes glowed faintly, and her movements were fluid, yet unnatural. She wore the same cruel smile as before, but her face was streaked with something that looked like tears. "Adunni," Kemi whispered, her heart aching at the sight of her friend. "Please, it's me. You can fight this. I know you're still in there." Adunni tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Why do you care so much?" she asked, her voice layered with an eerie echo. "You're risking everything for someone who doesn't deserve it." Kemi shook her head fiercely. "You're my friend. You've always been there for me, and now it's my turn. I won't leave you here." Adunni's smile faltered for a brief moment, and her blackened eyes flickered. "You're a fool," she said softly. "You can't save me. No one can." "I don't believe that," Kemi shouted, stepping forward. "I've seen you, Adunni. I've heard you. You're still in there, and I won't give up on you." The ground beneath them trembled, and Adunni's expression twisted into one of anguish. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "They won't let me go. They'll take you too." "I don't care," Kemi said, tears streaming down her face. "We'll face them together." Adunni's face contorted, and she fell to her knees, clutching her head. Her voice rose in a scream, raw and filled with pain. "They're coming," she cried. "Run, Kemi. Save yourself." Kemi hesitated, her heart pounding. She took a step toward Adunni, but before she could reach her, the air around them exploded with a deafening roar. The ground cracked violently, and massive shadowy figures emerged from the fissures, their forms twisting and writhing. The largest of them, towering and grotesque, fixed its glowing eyes on Kemi. Its voice boomed, shaking the very ground beneath her feet. "You dare defy the void." Kemi's knees buckled, but she forced herself to stand. "I came for Adunni," she shouted, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm not leaving without her." The creature laughed, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through her bones.
She is ours, it said.
And now, so are you? The shadowy tendrils surged toward her, their jagged edges gleaming. Kemi raised the knife, slashing at them desperately as they closed in. The blade glowed faintly, repelling the tendrils with each strike, but there were too many. Kemi? A dunny screamed, her voice piercing through the chaos. Don't let them take you.
Fight.
I won't leave you. Kemi shouted, her voice raw. She lunged toward a dunny, slashing at the tendrils that surrounded her friend. The knife cut through the darkness, its light growing brighter with each strike. The shadowy figures roared in fury, their forms flickering and distorting. Kemi reached a dunny and grabbed her hand, pulling her to her feet. We're getting out of here, she said, her voice fierce. A dunny's blackened eyes met hers, and for a moment, something human shone through. I'm sorry, she whispered. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. Kemi shook her head. It doesn't matter. We'll fix it. Together. The largest figure roared again, its tendrils surging toward them with renewed fury. The ground beneath them cracked and began to collapse, revealing a swirling abyss below. Kemi tightened her grip on a dunny's hand. Run, she shouted, pulling her friend toward a faint light in the distance. It was small, barely visible, but it was their only hope. The shadows pursued them relentlessly, their roars echoing through the void. The light grew brighter as they ran, its warmth cutting through the oppressive cold. Just as they reached the edge of the collapsing ground, the largest shadow lunged, its massive form blotting out the light. Kemi raised the knife, its blade blazing with an intense glow. She slashed at the creature, the light from the blade exploding outward in a blinding flash. For a moment, the void was silent. When the light faded, Kemi and a dunny were standing at the edge of a cliff, the shadows retreating into the darkness. The faint light was now a glowing doorway, shimmering with golden hues. A dunny's knees buckled, and Kemi caught her, holding her close. We're almost there, Kemi said, her voice trembling. Just a little further. A dunny looked at her, her blackened eyes still streaked with tears. Thank you, she whispered. The ground trembled violently, and the shadows began to surge toward them again. Kemi gripped the knife tightly and stepped toward the doorway, pulling a dunny with her. But as they approached, the largest shadow rose once more, its roar shaking the void. You cannot escape, it bellowed, its form expanding to block their path. Kemi raised the knife, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her. We'll see about that, she said, her voice defiant. The creature lunged, and the void erupted into chaos. The massive shadow lunged, its tendrils whipping through the air like living blades. Kemi shoved a dunny toward the glowing doorway, placing herself between her friend and the monstrous figure. Her heart pounded as she gripped the knife, its blade glowing faintly in the dim light of the void. The creature's voice boomed, shaking the ground beneath their feet. You cannot defy us. You will belong to the void forever. Kemi raised the knife high, her voice trembling but fierce. I will never leave her behind. If you want her, you'll have to go through me. The shadow hissed, its tendrils surging forward. Kemi slashed at them with all her strength, the knife cutting through the darkness with bursts of blinding light. Each strike sent tremors through the void, and the shadow roared in fury. Kemi, no! A dunny cried, her voice hoarse. You can't fight it alone. I'm not alone, Kemi shouted, glancing back at her friend. You're with me, a dunny. Fight it. You're stronger than this. A dunny hesitated, her blackened eyes flickering with faint glimmers of humanity. The shadow turned its attention to her, its voice a chilling growl. Do not listen to her.
You are one of us now.
Accept your fate. No. A dunny screamed, clutching her head. Her body trembled, and the ground beneath her cracked, glowing with crimson light. I don't belong to you. I never did. The shadow recoiled slightly, its form flickering. Kemi seized the opportunity, lunging forward and driving the knife into the creature's chest. The blade blazed with light, and the shadow let out an ear-splitting roar. The void trembled violently, the cracks in the ground spreading outward like a web. The air buzzed with an unnatural energy, and faint whispers echoed in the distance, too quiet to understand but loud enough to unsettle. Kemi's knife lay a few feet away, its blade glinting faintly in the dim light. She scrambled toward it, her fingers closing around the hilt as she stood, her heart racing. Her voice was hoarse when she called out, "Adunni? Eldern Ketchi? Are you here?" The whispers grew louder, overlapping one another, their words indistinct but mocking. Kemi turned in circles, clutching the knife tightly as the darkness seemed to close in. Shapes moved at the edges of her vision, flickering and fading before she could focus on them. "Show yourselves," she shouted, her voice trembling. "I'm not afraid of you." The whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the space into an unnerving silence. Then, a voice emerged low, cold, and familiar. "You should be—" Kemi turned sharply to see a figure emerging from the shadows. It was Adunni, but not. Her blackened eyes glowed faintly, and her movements were fluid yet unnatural. She wore the same cruel smile as before, but her face was streaked with something that looked like tears. "Adunni," Kemi whispered, her heart aching at the sight of her friend. "Please, it's me. You can fight this. I know you're still in there." Adunni tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Why do you care so much?" she asked, her voice layered with an eerie echo. "You're risking everything for someone who doesn't deserve it." Kemi shook her head, fiercely. "You're my friend. You've always been there for me, and now it's my turn. I won't leave you here." Adunni's smile faltered for a brief moment, and her blackened eyes flickered. "You're a fool," she said softly. "You can't save me. No one can." "I don't believe that," Kemi shouted, stepping forward. "I've seen you, Adunni. I've heard you. You're still in there, and I won't give up on you." The ground beneath them trembled, and Adunni's expression twisted into one of anguish. "You don't understand," she said, her voice breaking. "They won't let me go. They'll take you too." "I don't care," Kemi said, tears streaming down her face. "We'll face them together." Adunni's face contorted, and she fell to her knees, clutching her head. Her voice rose in a scream, raw and filled with pain. "They're coming," she cried. "Run, Kemi. Save yourself." Kemi hesitated, her heart pounding. She took a step toward Adunni, but before she could reach her, the air around them exploded with a deafening roar. The ground cracked violently, and massive shadowy figures emerged from the fissures, their forms twisting and writhing. The largest of them, towering and grotesque, fixed its glowing eyes on Kemi. Its voice boomed, shaking the very ground beneath her feet. "You dare defy the void." Kemi's knees buckled, but she forced herself to stand. "I came for Adunni," she shouted, her voice trembling but resolute. "I'm not leaving without her." The creature laughed, a deep, guttural sound that seemed to vibrate through her bones.
"She is ours," it said.
"And now, so are you?" The shadowy tendrils surged toward her, their jagged edges gleaming. Kemi raised the knife, slashing at them desperately as they closed in. The blade glowed faintly, repelling the tendrils with each strike, but there were too many. "Kemi!" Adunni screamed, her voice piercing through the chaos. "Don't let them take you."
"Fight."
"I won't leave you," Kemi shouted, her voice raw. She lunged toward Adunni, slashing at the tendrils that surrounded her friend. The knife cut through the darkness, its light growing brighter with each strike. The shadowy figures roared in fury, their forms flickering and distorting. Kemi reached Adunni and grabbed her hand, pulling her to her feet. "We're getting out of here," she said, her voice fierce. Adunni's blackened eyes met hers, and for a moment, something human shone through. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean for any of this to happen."
Kemi shook her head.
"It doesn't matter. We'll fix it. Together." The largest figure roared again, its tendrils surging toward them with renewed fury. The ground beneath them cracked and began to collapse, revealing a swirling abyss below. Kemi tightened her grip on Adunni's hand. "Run," she shouted, pulling her friend toward a faint light in the distance. It was small, barely visible, but it was their only hope. The shadows pursued them relentlessly, their roars echoing through the void. The light grew brighter as they ran, its warmth cutting through the oppressive cold. Just as they reached the edge of the collapsing ground, the largest shadow lunged, its massive form blotting out the light. Kemi raised the knife, its blade blazing with an intense glow. She slashed at the creature, the light from the blade exploding outward in a blinding flash. For a moment, the void was silent. When the light faded, Kemi and Adunni were standing at the edge of a cliff, the shadows retreating into the darkness. The faint light was now a glowing doorway, shimmering with golden hues. Adunni's knees buckled, and Kemi caught her, holding her close. "We're almost there," Kemi said, her voice trembling. "Just a little further." Adunni looked at her, her blackened eyes still streaked with tears. "Thank you," she whispered. The ground trembled violently, and the shadows began to surge toward them again. Kemi gripped the knife tightly and stepped toward the doorway, pulling Adunni with her. But as they approached, the largest shadow rose once more, its roar shaking the void. "You cannot escape," it bellowed, its form expanding to block their path. Kemi raised the knife, her hands steady despite the fear coursing through her. "We'll see about that," she said, her voice defiant. The creature lunged, and the void erupted into chaos. The massive shadow lunged, its tendrils whipping through the air like living blades. Kemi shoved Adunni toward the glowing doorway, placing herself between her friend and the monstrous figure. Her heart pounded as she gripped the knife, its blade glowing faintly in the dim light of the void. The creature's voice boomed, shaking the ground beneath their feet. "You cannot defy us. You will belong to the void forever." Kemi raised the knife high, her voice trembling but fierce. "I will never leave her behind. If you want her, you'll have to go through me." The shadow hissed, its tendrils surging forward. Kemi slashed at them with all her strength, the knife cutting through the darkness with bursts of blinding light. Each strike sent tremors through the void, and the shadow roared in fury. "Kemi, no!" Adunni cried, her voice hoarse. "You can't fight it alone." "I'm not alone," Kemi shouted, glancing back at her friend. "You're with me, Adunni. Fight it. You're stronger than this." Adunni hesitated, her blackened eyes flickering with faint glimmers of humanity. The shadow turned its attention to her, its voice a chilling growl. "Do not listen to her.
You are one of us now.
Accept your fate." "No," Adunni screamed, clutching her head. Her body trembled, and the ground beneath her cracked, glowing with crimson light. "I don't belong to you. I never did." The shadow recoiled slightly, its form flickering. Kemi seized the opportunity, lunging forward and driving the knife into the creature's chest. The blade blazed with light, and the shadow let out an ear-splitting roar. The void trembled violently, the cracks in the ground spreading out. The shadow writhed, its form distorting as the light from the knife consumed it. Kemi held on tightly, her hands shaking as she forced the blade deeper. "You cannot destroy me," the shadow bellowed, its voice cracking with rage. "I am eternal." "Maybe you are," Kemi said through gritted teeth. "But you'll never have her." With one final push, she drove the knife through the shadow's core. The creature exploded into a torrent of light and darkness, its form disintegrating into the void. The ground beneath them cracked open, and Kemi was thrown backward, landing hard on the jagged surface. Adunni rushed to her side, her face pale and tear-streaked. "Kemi, are you okay?" Kemi coughed, her body aching, but she managed a faint smile. "I'm fine. What about you?" Adunni hesitated, glancing down at her hands. The blackness in her eyes began to fade, replaced by the warm brown Kemi knew so well. I think it's leaving me," she said softly. "But I can still feel it, like a shadow lingering inside." "We'll deal with that later," Kemi said, pulling herself to her feet. She looked toward the glowing doorway, its light pulsating with a soothing warmth. "Right now, we need to get out of here." The ground shook violently, and the void roared in protest. The remnants of the shadowy figures began to converge, forming a swirling mass of darkness that loomed over them. "Kemi, it's not over," Adani cried, clutching her arm. "I know," Kemi said, her grip on the knife tightening. "But we're not giving up." The glowing doorway flickered, its light dimming as the swirling mass surged toward them. Kemi grabbed Adani's hand, pulling her toward the doorway with all the strength she could muster. "Run," she shouted, her voice barely audible over the deafening roar of the void. They sprinted toward the light, the ground crumbling beneath their feet. The shadowy mass closed in, its tendrils reaching for them with terrifying speed. Kemi swung the knife wildly, the blade glowing with each strike, but the shadows kept coming. As they reached the threshold of the doorway, the largest tendril lashed out, wrapping around Kemi's leg and pulling her back. She screamed, gripping the edge of the doorway with one hand as the other clutched the knife. "Kemi!" Adani cried, her eyes wide with terror. She reached out, grabbing Kemi's arm and pulling with all her strength. "I'm not leaving without you. Go!" Kemi shouted, her voice strained. "You have to make it out." "No." Adani screamed, tears streaming down her face. "I won't let you go." The shadows surged forward, their tendrils twisting and writhing as they tried to drag Kemi back into the void. The knife slipped from her grasp, falling into the swirling darkness below. Kemi's fingers began to slip from the edge of the doorway, the pull of the void growing stronger. Adani's eyes blazed with determination. "You saved me," she said, her voice trembling. "Now it's my turn." She gripped Kemi's arm tightly, pulling with all her strength. The light from the doorway flared brightly, engulfing them both as the shadows let out a final, enraged roar. The next thing Kemi knew, she was lying on soft grass, the warmth of the sun on her face. She opened her eyes slowly, blinking against the bright light. Around her, the familiar sights and sounds of the village came into focus. "Adani," she called weakly, sitting up. Adani was beside her, her face pale but her eyes clear and brown once more. She smiled faintly, tears glistening in her eyes. "We made it," she said softly. The villagers began to gather, their faces etched with awe and relief. Nkechi pushed through the crowd, her expression a mix of worry and pride. "You're both alive," she said, her voice shaking. "Thank the spirits." But before anyone could celebrate, a low, ominous rumble echoed through the air. The ground beneath them trembled, and a shadow passed over the sun. Kemi and Adani exchanged a terrified glance. "It's not over," Kemi whispered, her heart sinking. The low rumble grew louder, shaking the ground beneath the villagers' feet. The shadow over the sun darkened, casting an eerie pall across the once familiar landscape. The air thickened, heavy with an unnatural energy that sent chills down Kemi's spine. Adani gripped Kemi's arm tightly, her voice trembling. "What's happening? I thought we stopped it." Kemi shook her head, her heart pounding. "I don't know. Maybe it's not done with us." The villagers murmured nervously, their eyes darting between the sky and the girls. Nkechi stepped forward, her staff in hand, her face pale but resolute. "We must act quickly," she said, her voice commanding. "Whatever you encountered in the void has followed you here." Kemi's stomach sank. "How is that possible?" "We closed the doorway. We escaped." "The void does not release its claims easily," Nkechi replied grimly. She turned to the crowd. "Everyone, to the square. Bring the protective talismans and light the sacred fires." The villagers scattered, their fear driving them into action. Nkechi turned back to the girls, her expression grave. "You brought something with you," she said, her eyes locked on Adani. "A piece of the void still lingers." Adani looked down at her hands, her body trembling. "I can feel it," she whispered. "It's inside me. It's like a shadow I can't escape." Kemi placed a hand on her friend's shoulder, her voice firm. "We'll fight it. Together. Just like before." Nkechi shook her head. "This is no simple battle. The void has rooted itself in Adani's spirit. To remove it will require a ritual, a dangerous one." "I'll do whatever it takes," Adani said, her voice steady despite the fear in her eyes. Just tell me what I need to do. Nkechi studied her for a moment before nodding. Come with me. In the center of the village square, the sacred fires burned brightly, their flames casting long, flickering shadows across the ground. The villagers stood in a wide circle, clutching talismans and muttering prayers under their breath. Nkechi stood at the center with Kemi and Adunni, drawing intricate symbols on the ground with ash from the sacred wood. This ritual will force the void to release its hold, Nkechi explained, her voice steady. But it will fight back. You must be prepared for anything. Kemi stepped closer, her jaw set with determination. What can I do to help? You will anchor her, Nkechi said, handing Kemi a piece of woven cloth. Hold this tightly. It is bound to her spirit. No matter what happens, do not let go. Kemi nodded, gripping the cloth as though her life depended on it. She glanced at Adunni, her voice soft but firm. We'll get through this. I promise. Adunni managed a weak smile, but her eyes were filled with uncertainty. Thank you, she whispered, for not giving up on me. Nkechi raised her arms, chanting in a language older than the village itself. The symbols on the ground began to glow, and the flames of the sacred fires flared higher. The air vibrated with an unnatural energy, and a low, guttural growl echoed from somewhere unseen. Adunni cried out, clutching her head as a shadow began to rise from her body. It twisted and writhed, its form flickering between humanoid and monstrous. The villagers gasped and stepped back, their prayers growing louder. Hold on, Adunni, Kemi shouted, gripping the cloth tightly. You can do this. The shadow hissed, its blackened eyes locking onto Nkechi. You dare defy us again, it snarled, its voice deep and resonant. You cannot take what is ours. She is not yours, Nkechi shouted, her voice unwavering. You have no power here. The shadow surged forward, but the glowing symbols on the ground flared brightly, forcing it back. It howled in rage, its tendrils lashing out wildly. One struck Kemi, knocking her to the ground. The cloth slipped from her hand, and the connection between her and Adunni broke. No, Kemi screamed, scrambling to grab the cloth again. But the shadow seized the moment, wrapping its tendrils around Adunni and pulling her toward the edge of the circle. Adunni's screams pierced the air. Kemi, help me. Kemi lunged forward, grabbing the cloth and pulling with all her might. I've got you, she cried, her voice shaking. I won't let go this time. The shadow roared, its tendrils tightening around Adunni. Nkechi's chants grew louder, her voice commanding and relentless. The symbols on the ground pulsed with light, and the shadow began to flicker and distort. Adunni's body trembled violently, her eyes filled with tears. It's too strong, she cried. I can't fight it. Yes, you can, Kemi shouted. You're stronger than it is, Adunni.
You have to believe that.
Adunni's blackened eyes met Kemi's, and for a moment, the shadow's grip faltered. The light from the symbols grew brighter, and the sacred fires roared with intensity. With a final, piercing scream, Adunni threw her head back, and the shadow erupted from her body. It twisted and writhed, its form unraveling as the light consumed it. The ground shook violently, and the villagers clutched their talismans tightly. The shadow let out one last, agonized roar before disintegrating into nothingness. The air grew still, and the sacred fires burned low. Adunni collapsed into Kemi's arms, her body limp but her eyes clear. It's over, Nkechi said softly, her voice filled with relief. The void has released her. The villagers cheered, their voices rising in celebration. Kemi held Adunni tightly, tears streaming down her face. You're safe, she whispered. You're finally safe. Adunni smiled weakly, her voice barely audible. Thank you, Kemi, for everything. As the villagers gathered around them, the shadow over the sun faded, and the warm light of day returned. But in the distance, faint and almost imperceptible, a low rumble echoed once more, a reminder that the void was never truly gone.